welcome back to the Adventures in Advising podcast. As always, my name is Matt Markin, and on today's episode, it centers around advisor wellness and advisor retention, and more specifically, an organization that has been helping advising teams at multiple institutions through an advisor wellness grant initiative. And I thought it would be informative to listeners to talk about how this idea came about, how a grant can help with advisor wellness, learn about what kinds of innovative ideas have come from the grant, and even can you possibly implement ways to help with you or your team's wellness without a grant. So to talk about all of this, we have a returning guest and a first-time guest with us today. So let's welcome first-time guest to the podcast, Jennifer Nguyen, the Director of Post-Secondary Success at the Stupski Foundation. Jennifer, welcome.
Thanks for having me, Matt.
Yeah, great for you to be here. And let's also welcome back returning guest, Cheri Souza, the Hawaii Post-Secondary Success Program Officer, also at the Stupski Foundation. Welcome back, Cheri.
Hello, Matt. Thanks for having me.
So, Cheri, I know you've been on a couple times, but with Jen, this is your first time. So, Jen, I'd like to start out and throw the first question to you. If you want to talk about your path in higher ed and making it to the Stupski Foundation.
Well, thanks so much again, Matt, for having me. As you mentioned, my name is Jen. I'm the Director of Post-Secondary Success at the Stupski Foundation. And my origin story starts with both of my parents who were in college in Vietnam when they had to flee to the United States. So I am a first-generation college student who was born and raised in Houston, Texas. I ended up going to school on the East Coast, and I remember having a really challenging time in college, not necessarily academically, but socially, but ended up really, really enjoying my time once I found my people there. With that being said, when I graduated, I really wanted to pay it forward and to make sure that when students were making decisions about college, they had great guidance and were making decisions about a very transformative experience about going to college. So in the Bay Area, I ended up becoming a college counselor where I helped students get into the post-secondary institutions of their choice. But what I was noticing was that they were going to college, but they would come back a year later stating like, I want to go back to community college. I left my four-year institution, or I'm not quite sure if this was the fit for me. So after working as a college counselor, I ended up at California State University, East Bay as an academic support director. So on the tutoring side of things, complementing the advising side of things, really enjoyed my time doing that kind of retention and support work, but really thought about how can I have a bigger impact, just noticing all of these macroeconomic issues that I was noticing that was impacting my day-to-day operations at the tutoring center. And then happened to end up in this incredible role as the Director of Post-Secondary Success, where I get to work with folks like Cheri on my team and my colleague Malila and Miley in really trying to spend down the wealth of Joyce Stupski in the Bay Area and in Hawaii to ensure that students have the ability to go to a post-secondary institution or career of their choice.
Yeah, and you mentioned Stupski, so can you talk a little bit about, I know, Cheri, you answered this last year, but for those that may have missed that episode or want more of a refresher, Jen, can you talk about the Stupski Foundation?
Sure. The Stupski Foundation is a part of an ecosystem of foundations. There's so many different foundations across the country and in the Bay Area and Hawaii. We're a private family foundation. Basically, what we do is we give out money to institutions and to community-based organizations in different issue areas. The one that Cheri and I are a part of is the Post-Secondary Success Initiative. What a foundation is if you met one foundation and one person at a foundation, you basically just met one foundation and one person at that foundation because we're all very different. But the Stupski Foundation specifically is a spend down foundation. It was founded by Joyce Stupski and Larry Stupski, who was the former chief operations officer of Charles Schwab here in San Francisco. And really, they had a vision of wanting to make sure that they could spend their wealth and support organizations and institutions in the Bay Area and Hawaii, the places that they called home. And in this last part of the foundation's chapter, we are a spend down, which means that we're going to be spending all of our assets down over the next couple of years. And one of the things that we really wanted to invest in was the people of the Bay Area and Hawaii, specifically academic advisors. So that's a little bit about what we do at the Stupski Foundation and what makes our foundation unique.
So this year and last year, you offered a grant to those within NACADA's Region 9 centered around advisor wellness and retention. Can you talk about how this idea came about?
Sure. So I was an academic advisor in a previous life. I spent about 15 years with the University of Hawaii system. And, in my work, in talking to folks, and then in my transition to philanthropy, really heard a lot of folks saying that, there's a lot of burnout. Advisors are on the front lines during the pandemic, of course, even prior to then. Advisors take, a lot in as they're working with students, as they're helping them determine their academic goals. A student may come in to talk about their grades, but then you start asking, what happened this semester? Why all of a sudden we're noticing things aren't going as great as they were last semester? And then a lot more comes out. So academic advisors, have been on the front lines for quite some time. A lot of the work that we do in Stupski has been centered upon improving advising. And we realized that there may have been a little bit of a disconnect in that oftentimes when folks apply for grants, it's administration applying for grants, they have great projects. And then we'll do the check-ins and we'll talk to administrators. We'll also talk to folks on the ground. And sometimes we heard that, sometimes academic advisors weren't really involved in the grant making or the writing process. And so they were left to implement these great ideas, but often because they weren't a part of that process, they may have had ideas to do things a little bit differently. So taking that into consideration, talking with Jen, just as we're coming out of the pandemic, just hearing all of the issues of burnout, mental health, just wondering what more could we do to invest in advisors. We spoke with you as Region 9 chair at the time to find out how we could better support academic advisors and their institutions. And one of the things that came up was supporting academic advisor wellness. And so we thought, okay, what is the best way to support academic advisor wellness? And we thought, why don't we go to the advisors themselves, have them source these great ideas, have them submit proposals, have them submit concept notes, and come up with ideas really that would fit their institution and fit their needs. Because, as Jen mentioned, you met one foundation, you've met one foundation. Same goes with academic advising in institutions. You meet one institution, they're going to be quite different from the one, 20 miles down the road. So we really wanted to get academic advisors sourcing their own ideas for wellness. And that's kind of what this came out of. We also wanted to focus it in Region 9. Region 9 has a special place in my heart. Region 9 includes, California, Bay Area, as well as Hawaii. And we felt that Region 9 has done a lot of great work in terms of being a leader, in terms of diversity, inclusion. And so really wanted to give all of the states within Region 9, all of the territories and states in Region 9, the opportunity to apply for this. So that's kind of how this initiative came about within Region 9.
Yeah, and you mentioned, advisor burnout, wellness. Can you share maybe some of the reasons advisors are dealing with at their institutions, whether that's individuals you've talked to or through what was submitted?
That's a really great question. And one thing I wanted to build off of what Cheri just mentioned is that advisors have been on the front lines for a very, very long time, even before the pandemic. And there's a lot of burden placed on advisors when it comes to helping usher these student success outcomes that institutions are looking for. So even before the pandemic, I was noticing at my campus the amount of work that advisors were doing on behalf of the campus. But that being said, there's a whole host of large structural challenges that have transpired over the last couple of years that your audience is very, very well aware of that have really impacted advisors. First, there was a global pandemic that really impacted students, advisors, and the campuses. Then along with that, there was remote learning and remote work, which created a level of isolation for both students and staff members. But I think what I'm noticing in talking to our grantees was it wasn't necessarily the pandemic per se, that was a huge part of it, but it was the return that became really, really stressful for folks, where it might have been unclear sort of the strategy that the campus had in place, why people were coming back to work, who was coming back to work versus who wasn't. And I think that led to some larger issues that a lot of our campuses, not just the ones in this cohort, but other ones that I've talked to about trust between campus leadership as well as the people who are doing the work. I think that discord has created some level of burnout as well. And I'll also say the last thing that I think your audience is very well of is this idea of initiative fatigue. Over the last couple of years, there have been a number of student success initiatives, not just in California and Hawaii, but across the country to increase retention and graduation rates. And a lot of times it's people from the very, very top, not just necessarily campus leaders, but chancellors, funders, politicians who are really trying to dictate the terms of student success and the outcomes of trying to push the graduation rates forward. And often these decisions happen without the consent of the people on the ground who are doing the work. And so I've noticed over the last couple of years, and I certainly felt this when I was an employee at CSU East Bay and at other institutions, that there was a lot of stuff being told that I had to do without a lot of me having a say in how it was done. And I've noticed that that's starting to trickle down in the ways in which people are seeing their work, which might not have a lot of liberty and freedom anymore, creativity, which is what brought people into the advising profession in the first place, was to be with students, to feel creative, to feel liberating. And unfortunately, due to all these circumstances, as well as many, many more, dealing with compensation and pay and what we value in our society, I think it's just a conflation of those issues that's causing people to feel, not just burnt out, but underappreciated in the field, and perhaps even leaving the field at large, even though they truly and deeply love the work.
Yeah, and especially that last part. I mean, I've talked in past episodes where when this pandemic happened, just a few months later, I had colleagues that I thought would never leave. I thought they were lifers in higher ed, and they went in different directions. And some of them actually left without having anything in place in terms of job wise. And that really kind of opened my eyes to, wow, there's some, if anything, underlying issues that are going on. And kind of like you're talking about, there's a long list of things that it could be related to. And, now that it's been almost a year since the first cohort have received their grants, how have things gone for advising teams who've received the grant? Can you share a little bit about that?
Sure. A lot of the teams have shared that their grants are going well. We did have some teams with struggles, but happy to report that, a year in, everyone's on track, everyone's been implementing. So we've heard that there's a lot of power in casual community building events. So things, simple as catered parties, outings, happy hours that really allow folks to be in community with each other. Again, Jen had mentioned that we lost a lot of that, right? As things went virtual, people were working hybrid, just being in community with each other. You missed the opportunity to have those casual water cooler conversations. So these casual community building events really played a role in bringing people back to campus and getting folks together. Also hearing a lot of increased leadership skills. A lot of folks, as they're implementing this, have had to step into leadership roles, maybe unintended, when they initially wrote the grant. But a lot of them have been having conversations with administration about how they can institutionalize the practices, as well as really bringing recognition and, celebrating the advising profession. So those conversations have been having. We're hearing that advisors are feeling more a part of the community through different advisor voice. They've been able to really mobilize advisor voice and share their collective power. We've had organizations start with advisor-led commissions or advisor-driven decision-making processes, and really giving advisors a chance to have their voice heard. Unfortunately, some of the campuses were saying that in the past years, they kind of lost their voice. They lost their chance to contribute to communication, chance to contribute to decision-making practices across campus. But through some of these initiatives, they were really able to regain that power and that voice. So those are some of the things that really were going well. Of course, there were some challenges. Attendance has been a challenge, probably much like students. Getting advisors to one place at the same time sometimes caused some issues, but campuses have been really creative. Some of the challenges around attendance, though, is really advisors are doing so much work. I think Jen alluded to that earlier. Advisors have, sometimes unfortunate huge caseloads in addition to other things that they're doing. So how do you create space, create the culture where advisors feel that it's okay to step away for a little bit and take the time for themselves? One of the other campuses, what they did around attendance was they started including advisor families, because they said, you know what, show up as your true self, bring your family to these events. And they found that attendance did increase, as they were able to bring people in their lives with them, because a lot of times, advisors aren't able to participate maybe in a happy hour because they have childcare responsibilities at home, or maybe they're taking care of their parents. But by enabling them to bring those people with them, that created a whole nother level of ohana, or family, as we call it in Hawaii.
The list of things that Cheri just named out is comprehensive, and it's really incredible what campuses have been able to do with these grants. And it's really easy to cast these things aside and say, oh, it's just a fun event. It's just a retreat. It's just a breakfast. But what I think matters the most to the two of us is not the what, but the how, right? What I found was two things happened, over the last year. One is Cheri and I gave these grants away with the understanding that the advisors had complete control over the funds. They could dictate if they wanted to use it for a little bit of staffing, for stipends, for events. But the emphasis was that they had total control over the funds. And occasionally Cheri and I would just pose some questions of a why. for what they would do for an initiative, but we wanted to be supportive. And it's this idea of money as medicine, because oftentimes on campuses, money is handed over to folks, but there's so many strings attached that it feels sometimes like a little bit of a punishment of a lot more work for a little bit of money. But we wanted to change that narrative in a small way with these funds. I think the second thing that's really important, and Cheri was outlining this so well, was the how. It's the idea that advisors were coming up with these events and not necessarily administrators or campus leaders. But I think that matters a lot, is who dictates what happens and who has the choices and the authority to be able to say that we're going to put on a retreat. So I think, the list is easy to say, oh, they just did a bunch of stuff. But what we see is actually there's a lot of planning and a lot of community building and a lot of collective decision-making power leading up to these events that I think is extremely transformative and systems change oriented.
Yeah, absolutely.
Can I add one more thing?
Yeah, go for it.
I think just, hearing what Jen's saying, a lot of it too was advisors asking themselves in the advising community, how do we heal and how do we move on? And really for each community, what does healing look like? And a lot of times it was just being in community with each other and being able to have those open and honest conversations that sometimes, as you're in the day-to-day grind, you're not able to stop and pause and have that reflection space. And so by creating these really fun events, it let people rebuild those relationships, rebuild that trust so that they're then able to have those harder conversations down the line.
Yeah, and you were talking about these events and the planning that goes into it. Now, one of the things too with this grant was that they also had to have an administrator advocate. Do you think that has also helped with advisors being able to do a lot of this planning and kind of being this middle person between the advising team and higher administrators?
Absolutely. I'd love to hear Cheri's perspective about this, having been an academic advisor at her campus. But what I'm finding is the administrative advocate can answer questions like, when we receive the funds, where does the money go and how can we use it in an effective and efficient manner? For a lot of the advisors that we work with, this is their first time receiving a private family grant, a philanthropic grant. And the delivery mechanism of the funds is so complicated that having an administrative advocate is really, really key just to begin that process. But then also, it's a way to be able to get other advocates, not just that administrative advocate, but other people in the campus ecosystem to have buy-in on these initiatives. So it's little things like people would have retreats and a breakfast, or maybe they produce a video or a social media post, and the administrative advocate would invite other folks who are part of the administration to these events as a strategy to get further deployment of events through other sources of funds in the future. So I think it's those little things of just having those connections and that guidance internally of how you can effectively both use the funds that you have now, but then also simultaneously advocate for other sources of funds in the future to sustain those initiatives.
And you were also mentioning, I think Cheri's mentioning the events, like bringing family to some of the events. But is there anything else you want to mention in terms of any other innovative ideas that may have come out from these advising teams of what they've been implementing?
Yeah, I'm happy to mention a few. I would be curious to know if Cheri has some favorites as well. I would say, I know it's a small thing, but at least 2 campuses decided that they wanted to create physical space that was exclusively for advisors. And it seems like a small thing, but the idea that you have complete control over a space where you could be with other advisors, there's no other students or no other personnel around, and to create that psychologically safe physical space, I think has been key and important. Now, there have been a number of questions, like how can you equitably provide access to that space? Who is an advisor on campus, and how do we define that term for people to be able to activate those space? Those are different questions. But overall, this idea of a physical space has resonated a lot with me personally. The other thing that folks have done, which I believe your campus, Matt, has done as well, is they've created different criteria for Advisor of the Year awards. A lot of times an Advisor of the Year or a Staff Member of the Year award comes off as a very competitive, almost like clout chasing kind of process. And it can create discord in a community. But we've had so many innovative folks decide to revisit the criteria for Advisor of the Year and think about criteria such as like, how can we progress collaborative qualities? How can we actually sort of assess for somebody who is a great team member and who lifts other people up in the process? So I think that has been really, really wonderful. And I'm really big, Cheri just mentioned this, on advisor-led commissions and committees. But again, it's not the what, but the how, because people can create committees, but that could actually be pretty bad for your mental health because then you're stuck in committees sometimes. But what I found with our grantees is that they've been very intentional about upskilling themselves with facilitation practices and making sure that their outputs and outcomes for that particular commission or committee, so that doesn't feel like just another thing that you have to add to your plate, but it actually feels like a transformative place where people can talk about advising issues, but can also talk about how they can move forward. So I think those are the things that have come to mind. Although, Cheri, I'm just curious to know if there's anything that resonates with you that hasn't already been stated.
I think the one that I would add, and I really love this one, was the micro externships. So one of our campus created micro externships, and so it allowed they were able to get permission for their academic advisors to take some time to actually spend time in another office. So we had advisors, say, spending time in the financial aid office and really learning what happens in the financial aid process, because a lot of times as academic advisors you do a lot of referring, and by really being able to spend time, an actual good chunk of time in that office to learn what's happening there, I think you have more empathy for the other office. And then you also know what students are experiencing as they go to those other offices. So I think that's one that really stood out, because it's just continuous professional development, and it really helps advisors increase their knowledge, but then it really benefits students directly as well.
And I just want to jump in with another really small thing here. I like that people are using the funds for catered dinners and lunches. And I know it seems, again, small and fluffy in many cases, but the idea that you don't have to coordinate a potluck, that you don't have to coordinate making your own food or facilitating your own retreat, which creates more stress, is actually a really big thing for me, because then people can be in the moment and they can enjoy it with one another without worrying about the logistics. And I think one of my secret sort of like campaigns right now is trying to figure out how to get campuses to see the idea of paying for meals for staff members when it's aligned with procurement practices and aligned with reimbursement practices, when it aligns, but actually to make sure that we get more opportunities for staff members to not have to spend money out of their own pocket to be able to take care of themselves and to be in community with other people. That's kind of one of the grand experiments that we have here, is showing that meals, even though people tend to see negatively like these idea of meals on campuses for staff members, if we can make it work and it's aligned with policy, it actually does provide some level of really transformative behaviors around interacting in the spaces that are wellness spaces.
Yeah, just something to add with the food, with catering, and maybe this happens at other institutions. Maybe it was just with ours, like when we were using the grant. But how important just having food there and having it be a meal that, like you're saying, they could just go easily get. You don't have to stress about it. Don't have to worry about, is everyone going to bring what they're supposed to bring for the potluck. But when we had, or our first event we had a speaker. It was kind of our kickoff event, and then we had a catered breakfast. And we had told advisors that it was going to be a catered breakfast. We gave them an idea of what types of food were going to be there. But we had a couple advisors come up to us afterwards to say, like, we actually ate breakfast before coming to work, because we actually didn't think it was going to be this full catered event, and it was going to just be, pastries and some orange juice. And they actually really appreciated the fact that we were able to spend some of that money on food. So that was something that our team kind of re-looked at for other events to make sure, if we could have catered breakfast, lunch, whatever it might be, let's do it, especially if advisors are feeling very positive afterwards attending the event.
And Matt, what's great about your example is it shows how ridiculousness the controversy around staff food is.
Right?
Because if you imagine, like, we don't ask our students to pay for the pizza that we give out at outreach events. And I don't think any board of regents at a state level has to do their own potluck when they get together, right? Maybe they do, and more power to those folks. But, the people in the middle need to have the same privileges that we give to our students to some extent, as well as to the people at the top. And a small thing like that, for some reason, is a big deal on campuses. And we want to make sure that it doesn't feel like it's a big deal, because those small things actually add up to making sure that someone feels like they belong on the campus.
Absolutely. And, both of you talked about a lot of these ideas and things that have been implemented by the institutions. But of course, someone might be listening thinking, okay, well, how do we know what was intended to happen actually happened? Did they see improvements? So have you heard from some of the advising teams that have found any type of evidence or through surveys that these ideas that they've implemented have helped with the improvement of their advisor wellness?
A couple of our advising teams actually did pre and post surveys. I think that's what you get, when you're in higher education. There's so much emphasis put on assessment. And the assessment is great because it's then allowing the advising teams to go to their institutions to try and ask for funding or ask, for the institutionalization of these wellness initiatives. But one institution in particular, UNLV, did a pre and post survey with their participants and found an increase. They had surveyed folks on 7 metrics of wellness. So it was occupational, spiritual, intellectual, physical, emotional, environmental, and social. And after folks had participated in their activities, they found an increase in all 7 metrics, with the greatest increase in social wellness. And I think that social wellness piece, it goes back to, what we're saying, just building that community, allowing them to have food, allowing folks to really just break bread and be in community with each other to build relationships and build trust, has really helped them. Across campuses, we've heard that advisors are feeling more connected and more engaged with their campus and their advising peers. We're hearing that there's a lot more conversations happening about the climate of academic advising. Advisors, again, are feeling more connected with each other and even their advising families. And advisors are really being encouraged to just show up as their authentic selves. And I think all of these small things are really contributing to the overall academic, the wellness of academic advisors, as well as advisor sustainability. In the beginning of the podcast, you had mentioned that you heard a lot of friends or, just colleagues that you knew ended up leaving during the pandemic. And that's one of the things we worry about. Academic advisors play such a huge role in the student journey. And a lot of folks were leaving. And so by creating these spaces, by really creating these wellness initiatives, by creating community, we're really hoping that one of the outcomes is creating sustainability within the advising profession and making this normalized, like making advising teams, administrative teams, campus leadership realize that investing in people is so important, ensuring that they feel heard, ensuring that they feel safe, ensuring that they feel like they have an opportunity to really contribute to the overall status of their profession, to the institution, to the work that they're doing is so important. And sometimes, some of the initiatives don't cost a whole lot of money, right? By just giving folks a nice place to speak, being able to give them the opportunity to contribute to ideas that are happening on campus, by really uplifting the work they do. Of course, it's great, if you can accompany that with a breakfast or something, but a lot of times it's really just paying attention to the people. And ultimately, we're hoping that through these initiatives, the campuses, the institutions are going to realize that there's a lot that can happen when you support the wellness of advisors. One of the awesome things that we're hearing is this academic advising wellness initiatives are really kind of leading the way on a lot of campuses in terms of overall campus wellness and community wellness. And so really hoping that as we move forward, to the end of year 1, we're looking at, and we check in with more folks, really hearing about the outcomes of their grants, and then looking forward to the second cohort that we have going as well.
Someone listening to this might say, this all sounds great, but I'm not in Region 9, or, I don't know how I could do this without having funds, having a grant. So let's say someone's in a position, or advising team's in a position to where they want to improve their advisor wellness. Do you have any suggestions for them, especially if they are not in a position where they could get a grant? Or, I guess going along with that, are there any of these ideas mentioned that you think could be implemented without funding? And Cheri, you kind of were alluding to some of that, but I'll throw that over to Jen.
Yeah, for sure. And one thing I want to mention is these grants are not very big. I mean, they're sizable in the sense it's $30,000 and it's in the complete control of the advisors, but relative to a campus budget, it's a small line item. So that's something to keep in mind, what Cheri just mentioned, that a lot of these practices and programs and initiatives that people have implemented have not actually taken that much money. And in many cases is leveraging events and practices that people had before, but just accelerating it moving forward. So I just want to keep that in mind. Is just wellness doesn't necessarily have to be expensive, although it's always nice to be able to have discretionary funds, especially within your control. I would say if you're thinking about implementing an advising initiative on your campus, or advising wellness initiative on your campus, one is to start where Cheri started with her explanation, which is to make the case and to try to figure out any kind of data, whether it's through survey or through climate surveys in particular, how advisors are feeling on campus. There's a number of instruments and tools. Cheri and I are happy to communicate with folks to talk about what those specific instruments and tools are that campuses have used. But really, it just boils down to creating some kind of pre and post so that you're able to assess what the current climate is on campus. And then you're able to go up to your own administrative advocate and say, hey, there's something that's happening on this campus. It's going to be a detriment in the future for this campus to continue operating this way, especially because the retention of advisors is so important. It's so expensive to recruit other people to come into the campus. And it's also really expensive to provide the level of professional development to bring them up to speed to where a current advisor is. That's the argument that I would make, that we need to do something about it. Then I would do an assessment of the wellness practices that the campus currently has already, either as a whole campus or as individual departments, including the advising departments, and to see if there's any way to align those existing practices with what advisors actually want. So again, it's not the what, but the how. So if you're able to just listen to advisors and ask, how can we adjust current practices, or even try to get what we're currently doing right now with events or with maybe like meetingless Fridays, for example, if we can make it more aligned to advisor voice, that can make a big difference. But with that being said, the idea is that private foundation money, this is only a 1-year grant. It's going to go away anyways, because we are not going to be around forever. We're a spend down foundation. So the idea is to be able to get the campus on board to give them more permanent sources of money. So in many cases, if you don't have a grant, you're kind of accelerating your process to sustainability without having the money to begin with. And making the case will be incredibly important. To answer the second part of your question, the quote unquote cheaper things that you could do from the get-go, I would say, revisiting the advisor awards are a really, really big thing. Developing decision-making processes that are inclusive of advisors, because again, it's not just pay that is making people leave the field, it's also a lack of say as well. And so if there's any way to listen to advisors and to center their voices and decision-making practices, that can go absolutely in a long way to retaining advisors on campus. So those are things that come in mind immediately. But what I will say is a lot of it is just making sure that people feel like they have a voice. And so whatever people choose to do, as long as advisor voice is in the process, you just make that event or that initiative that much better and more worthy of an advisor feeling like they belong on campus.
And we've been talking about this initiative, talking about advisor wellness, but for the both of you, what do you do for your wellness?
I like to be outdoors. So anything from going to the beach, going hiking. My son is really active. My son and daughter are both active in sports. So spending the weekends at the baseball or the soccer field. Just love being outside and just being outside and just doing things in nature, running, anything outside.
I'm similar to Cheri, although Cheri can run a marathon without training, and I would probably die if I did that. So I'm a worse runner than Cheri, but I still try. I found that I love being in community with family and friends. And so I try to take any opportunity to spend time with the people that I love, whether it's, my partner, my parents, my sister, my friends. It is API Heritage Month. And so I'm really trying to spend a lot of time in community with fellow API advocates and folks who are really doing fantastic work. And that keeps me inspired, not just for the short term, but for the long term. And next month is Pride. So I'm going to do the same with my LGBTQ plus colleagues as well, but really, really trying to tap into the incredible energy and wisdom of folks around me.
Well, you both are inspiring to me. I've gotten to know you both over the last couple years. So thank you so much for being on the podcast today. Thank you for sharing your expertise on this, about the Stupski grant, and then what advising teams have been creative and innovative things they've been doing. So thank you both so much for being on the podcast today.
Thank you so much, Matt. I'm curious to know, what is your wellness practice? Is it podcasting?
Let's say when I first started doing podcasting, it was something that I was like, oh, great, this is my wellness, something I get to do outside of work. And then it kind of then became its own job. So maybe not so much with that, but kind of like you're talking about, like family, friends, especially. I don't run, I walk. I don't think I could ever do a marathon like the both of you. But traveling is something over the last few years that I've gone into, and then the pandemic happened. So I'm kind of catching up on places to go. So my partner and I are looking forward to whether it's across country or going to Hawaii. That's on our list. So we have a long list, and we're trying to start scratching those places off our list. So Cheri, I might be in Hawaii. We might be in Hawaii soon.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having us. It was so fun talking to you.
Yeah, same here. All right, take care.